No, we're going to pause. There we go. Welcome, everyone, to our fifth and next to the last session in our discussion of Jung's final major writing, The Undiscovered Self. We're talking about chapter 5. And for those of you who are watching this via recording, we've got Mike here behind me, since he's the only other live person. So I'll do my best to let everybody chat. And last week when we had more people live than on Zoom, it got a bit interesting trying to manage everybody's comments, but this I think will be a little easier. So let's begin. We've already, before I started the recording, been doing some reflection on the discussion from last week in chapter 4. So does anybody have anything else that you want to share about that, or are you ready to dive into the reading for today, chapter 5?
Well, there was so much more left over from last week, but that's okay.
Yeah, the consensus was chapter 4 was a pretty deep.
Yeah, we barely got through half of it, but we were talking about transferences, like between therapists and priests, and between a client and a therapist, and maybe even a parishioner and a priest, transferences, and what they were in projections and counter transferences, and the importance of having a transference in order for the healing, but I think I remembered the quote: therapy doesn't begin until there's a transference, but it doesn't end until it's withdrawn or something like that. But the important thing that I was thinking about is that one person has to remain conscious. This is not really what's happening. It's a transference. And it's usually up to the therapist, or let's say a priest, to realize that that's what it is. It's a transference. It's not actually, those feelings aren't naturally. Am I being clear enough, David? Can you finish that?
Well, you're being clear enough to me, but then I know what you're talking about. For the others who are not clinicians, that may have been total Greek. So, and fair disclosure, both Sandy and Rita and I are all graduates of the same school in Santa Barbara. So for us, this is we're used to this lingo. For those of you who are not clinicians, if we begin talking all Greek, please stop us. And feel free to ask for an explanation in plain English instead of psychobabble, okay? And that was part of, I think, the struggle with understanding the previous chapter, because Jung does get into more of the sort of technical understanding of what happens in the therapeutic relationship from his understanding. And if you weren't familiar with that, then he might as well have been talking Greek. And I think it's important to put a larger context, is what he's really talking about is what is the process by which we come to know ourselves as unique individuals, because as we've been hearing all along, for Jung, the antidote to what he calls mass-mindedness, or the tendency of people to get caught up in a mass movement and then be led down a primrose path and easily manipulated, as we have seen of late. The antidote to that is people who remain grounded in themselves and who are sufficiently individuated to resist that pull into the mass, and to remain above it and be able to critically ask themselves, do I really want to follow this guy? Is this really what I want to do? What is my own internal moral compass direct me to do? And that's a crucial question in this time. I was just reading this morning an article from the Sacramento Bee about the kinds of disruptions that are happening at the local level, at school boards, at supervisors meetings, at city council meetings, all across the state, by folks espousing conspiratorial, far right, anti this and that all in the guise of my personal freedom. Well, as I have said on more than one occasion, your personal freedom ends where your neighbor's nose begins. And they seem to lose sight of that. And that's the kind of thing that Jung is talking about. These people who get caught up in mass movements and get sucked down a rabbit hole of these odd notions. And then, of course, the critical danger is then they actually act on them. They don't just verbalize threats, they actually carry them out. And that's the danger that he would call mass-mindedness. Yes, Sandra.
Oh, I've been thinking about this whole time we've been talking about the book, because my impression, but it could be wrong, is that when we compare what was happening in Germany, and I think Jung also, lived through World War I and World War II, and was horrified by, both of those. And then we talked about the Hungarian revolt that happened a few months before he put a note in there.
Right.
And
56.
My impression, but maybe it's wrong, is that the state of Germany at that time was the mass mindedness he's talking about, that it encompassed a majority of people. Where when I look what's happening in the US now, it seems like there's it's half and half. Like there's half one way and half another way on any topic. And so that didn't stop events like January 6th happening, but maybe it would stop the whole country from following a particular ideology or charismatic leader or whatever is coming up in the future, do you think?
We would certainly hope so, wouldn't we?
Sandy, I don't think so. What I understand about the early days of Nazism was that Hitler's followers were certainly a minority, maybe somewhere around 35% of Germans identified with it and wanted to go that way. But there wasn't any unified Democratic Party, if you will. There were a lot of parties. There were communists and socialists and several stamps of democratic parties. There was nobody who stood out in clear opposition. And I think that's politically why Hitler rose to power, is he had a large faction, but not a majority. And that's what scares everything out of me with our current situation.
Mm-hmm. But to Barry's point, I mean, the larger question is, if it's true that there was a relatively small percentage of the German populace that say were true believers in National Socialism, how was it that the mass of other Germans were willing to go along with it and not rise up against it? And that gets back to the appeals to national pride and nationalism following Germany's defeat in the First World War. And as I've said before, my own question to my grandmother about why that happened, and her response was, he made us proud to be Germans again.
Could it also have been the fact that there wasn't the communication that there is today, so that people couldn't have different points of view all over the country? And as soon as you voiced anything, you were silenced and immediately gotten rid of.
Right.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if those two factors had a big part in it also.
Thank you for bringing that up, Rita. Yeah, I was going to say the other major difference is technology and social media, and the algorithms that we've been hearing about so much on the news that social media uses to continue to feed you things that the algorithm thinks you're going to like, because they make their advertising money by keeping you on the site. And it's just like, anytime you've purchased anything from Amazon, it's, a nanosecond before they say, oh, well, since you like this, you might like these things. That's what the algorithm does. It tracks everything you do and then feeds you more of the same, which feeds into what psychologists call confirmation bias. And that is our tendency to take in things that confirm what we already believe and filter out anything that contradicts our stated position. And that's how people get sucked down the rabbit hole of these various conspiracy theories and anti-vax misinformation and all that kind of stuff, is that you just have to take a few steps inside and the algorithm just sucks you right in.
And the question is, why does it suck some people in and not others?
Right. And that's exactly what Jung is pointing to in this book. Why is it that some people can pull themselves out and ask the question, hey, wait a minute, where's this coming from? Where is it going? And do I want to follow? And turn the app off or leave the site or whatever it takes. Versus those who don't and do get sucked in, who are a minority, but as this article in this morning's Bee pointed out, they are an extremely vocal minority, and they can organize using social media, whether it's, a Facebook page or something else. So let's chew a little bit on this chapter specifically, and I want to point to a couple of things that I highlighted. We talked a little bit in the previous session about Jung's contrasting creedal religion and science, and as that gulf continues to widen, and remembering he's writing this in the mid-1950s, so science has come an awful lot further and potentially widening the gulf. So he talks about let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 paragraphs or 3 paragraphs into the chapter, depending on which version. If you're looking at the PDF, it's on page 53. For Rita, you and I, it's paragraph 551. Theology rejects any tendency to take the statements of its earliest records as written myths, and accordingly to understand them symbolically, which is what he's been advocating. Indeed, it is the theologians themselves who have recently made the attempt, no doubt as a concession to knowledge, in quotes, to demythologize the object of their faith while drawing the line quite arbitrarily at crucial points. And again, that's a reference to Rudolf Bultmann, a German post-World War II theologian who coined the term demythologizing the New Testament. I mean, I read his books when I was in seminary. And in the next paragraph then, he says the rupture between faith and knowledge is a symptom of the split consciousness, which is so characteristic of the mental disorder of our day. In other words, we still have a tendency to engage in some magical thinking. Microchips hidden in the vaccine, 5G towers are going to drive you crazy. In the guise of science. And on the one hand, and I think I mentioned the book last week, Guaranteed Pure, which is a study of the Moody Bible Institute in Chicago and the rise of fundamentalism in the late 19th century in the US as a direct reaction to the perceived threat of Darwinism and evolution, which led to, of course, the now infamous Scopes monkey trial in Tennessee in the 1920s. And it continues to this day. There's a rupture between the mainline Protestant churches and the so-called evangelical or fundamentalist Christian churches, which used to be about theological grounds, but now is as much on political grounds. So that wedge has continued to be driven between those who will just accept, God said it, I believe it, that settles it, versus those of us who are saying, well, no, wait a minute. What did that really mean in Greek when it was written 2,000 years ago? And so Jung is quite aware, having grown up himself in a Swiss Protestant Zwinglian household with his father being a pastor, that this perceived rift between science and faith continues, which is why he's at pains to say when he's talking about religion is the antidote to mass-mindedness, he doesn't mean believing in a creed. He means a personal numinous experience, the kind Paul had on the road to Damascus, as I've said. Thoughts, reactions? Anything else?
Pretty straightforward.
Mike says, yeah.
One of my thoughts is this church has many wonderful members who believe things all over the place. And when I first started in this church, Father Christopher had said, Episcopalians agree to disagree. And
Yes,
what I was,
that's the broad church approach.
what I was,
Christopher and I were at seminary at the same time, by the way.
what, Christopher and you?
Yeah. So we've known each other for over 40 years.
And so at the time when I started, which was a long time ago, I don't know, was it 30 years ago? It was a long time ago when Father Fred was here. And there were, at that time, there were what you would call nature worshipers in the church. And then we do have some fundamentalist type members. And we have members who, for a period of time, there were a lot of members reading Course in Miracles, which then other members thought was from the devil. And so we have all of those people here in the church. And somehow we, most of the time, get along and love each other. And not that we're always tolerant. I hear people say things, but most of the time we get along. There's something that draws us to each other, go figure.
Yeah, and to that extent, this church community is a reflection of the eclectic kind of funky nature that is Nevada City and Nevada County. I mean, we've got conservative Republicans and we've got old hippies. We've got the Ananda commune up on the San Juan Ridge, and you've got, Lake of the Pines that's a dot of red and a sea of blue. And a lot of it's decidedly purple. It's not this or that. It's a curious blend, as you were saying, Sandy. I want to take a look at another paragraph. If you're looking at the PDF version, it's the bottom of page 54 and on to 55. It's not one that I highlighted, so it's not going to be in yellow. Actually, in the collected works, it's not a separate paragraph, but in the PDF version, it is a separate paragraph. I just discovered, which is why it was hard for me to find it on both. He says, no one seems to notice that the veneration of the word, which was necessary for a certain phase of historical development, has a perilous shadow side. That's such a Jungian comment. The shadow. That is to say, the moment the word, as a result of centuries of education, attains universal validity, it severs its original link with the divine person. There is then a personified church a personified state. Belief in the word becomes credulity, and the word itself an infernal slogan capable of any deception. There are some of us who would point at certain so-called evangelical churches and say, they're the people of the lie, because they're actively spreading misinformation in the guise of freedom of speech. Let's see. With credulity come propaganda and advertising to dupe the citizen with political jobbery and compromises. And the lie reaches proportions never known before in the history of the world. As I reread that last night, that last line hit me like a ton of bricks. With credulity come propaganda and advertising to dupe the citizen with political jobbery and compromises. And the lie reaches proportions never known before in the history of the world. We are once again living through such a time. And it's not just here. It's all over the planet. Jung's point is, this isn't about any one people or any one nation. This is part of the basic construct of the human psyche, and that's the part that we need to wrap our heads around. Because we all have that shadow. We love to point the finger at those guys over there. But that's, as he would say, you're just fooling yourself. You're ignoring your own shadow.
That's a very common trait of evangelicals, at least in my experience. It's an us versus them.
Okay, say more, because I've never been part of the evangelical world.
Oh, it was always, you know, and that's why they got so political, because we have to make our voices known, which is fine, but it's, Jesus was all about bringing unity to mankind. He died for everybody, not just
People like us.
people like us, right? And so I don't know how many times in studies or groups of Christians, it's like, it was always this mentality of us versus them. It's those people over there, the unsaved, us, the saved. And we know better. We need to change their minds.
So is it a sense of being persecuted or being in a minority?
It was always
or-
that. I think they knew that we would be persecuted sooner or later.
Okay.
And that is, I think, still quite a fallacy that they believe in. At least in the circles that I was in. It was always like, if we don't get out there, if we don't take over, they're gonna come and persecute us. You know,
Okay.
the Antichrist is coming. We're gonna be the first victims. That was very wound up in evangelicalism and Pentecostalism, my experience.
Okay. Thanks for sharing that. Let me get back. I want one more little quote from Jung, and then I'll open up to some more conversation. Right after that sentence in the next paragraph, he says, thus, the word, originally announcing the unity of all men, as you were just saying, and their union in the figure of the one great man, capital M, has in our day become the source of suspicion and distrust of all against all. Credulity is one of our worst enemies, but that is the makeshift the neurotic always resorts to in order to quell the doubter in his own breast or conjure him out of existence. Thoughts, reactions?
Well, I just say it rings very true. It's quite amazing that he was able to get this principle so long before we see it just coming out in spades in our current times.
Yeah, for something written 65 years ago, it sure rings true today, doesn't it?
Yeah.
There's so much, I didn't even know where to start sometimes, you know.
Well, that's okay. Just pick a spot. Dive in.
Yeah. It's over and over again. Of course, it's Jung. It's talking about being conscious and
Yeah.
really knowing thyself and not having the shadow side or the part we don't recognize in ourselves, to try to be as conscious as we can, and consciousness and be aware of how other people are reacting on shadow sides of themselves and or following, rather than really being a whole person. He was always talking about trying to recognize your shadow and individualize, which means become complete.
Right. Yeah, in paragraph 559, if you're looking at the PDF version, it's the paragraph that starts on the bottom of page 58. Getting back to both of those comments, he says, the communist revolution has debased man far lower than democratic collective psychology has done, because it robs him of his freedom not only in the social, but in the moral and spiritual sense. Aside from the political difficulties, the West has suffered a great psychological disadvantage that made itself unpleasantly felt even in the days of German Nazism. The existence of a dictator allows us to point the finger away from ourselves and at the shadow. He is clearly on the other side of the political frontier, while we are on the side of good and enjoy the possession of the right ideals. I mean, that's exactly what Mike was just talking about. It's the us versus them. And what makes America unique is that we're such a diverse nation of immigrants from all over the place that it gives rise to this white supremacist, nationalist kind of culture war, the purity, the sense that we and our way of life are under attack, which therefore is used to justify violence. You know, it's a war to save the country, is the way it's phrased. And again, thinking about some of the people that were quoted in the B article, which, you know, I read electronically and I saved because there was a lot in it, but it talked about board of supervisors in Shasta County. And there was a clip of, you know, people talking at the school board in Rockland and the Oroville City Council, and the list goes on and on and on and on. In the more rural, more reddish parts of even in, you know, so-called pure blue liberal California. It ain't all pure blue and liberal, but we know that, you know, as soon as you get outside the major metro areas, it becomes decidedly more purple and red. But that's what this tendency to point fingers. And 10, 12 years after he wrote this, I remember just as I was sort of coming of age and being aware of the Vietnam War, the scandal over the My Lai massacre in Vietnam. And, you know, how could we're the good guys. We're always the ones with the white hats. We could never do something that terrible, let alone the whitewashing of American history about what we did to the native population of this continent. Which, again, I grew up in Arizona. 1/3 of the state is Indian reservation. I was never taught that in public school. I had to read it in a book when I was in college. Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee by D. Brown. That sort of gives the rest of the story from the Indians' perspective, and it ain't pretty. So, but we want to demonize somebody else, Jung would say, so that we don't have to look at our own shadow. And as I said in the article that was published in the Union last summer, responding to the furor over critical race theory, the very first step in analysis is confronting the shadow. I mean, your own shadow, looking at your own crap that's hiding in the back of your own closet and owning it. Because only then do you really know who you are. in your totality. And that's the first step towards what Jung would say is this kind of deeper self-knowledge, to get over the tendency to project all of your negative traits onto those people and deny that they exist within yourself.
Fascinating.
I'm wondering if it goes back to the kind of animal part of ourselves. That part, what's that, amygdala, this part back down here?
The limbic system,
You know, the amygdala, wait, hold on, I'll get
the
the,
amygdala, yeah, that's in the center of the limbic system.
yeah, down here in the base of the brain. And, you know, it has to be mediated and grow. Okay, I'm not being clear today, excuse me, but it kind of comes back to, well, if I don't gather with people of my like kind, the other animals are going to get me. If I'm a deer, I better stay with the herd of deers because the lions are going to get me. And I think that basically goes down to fear. I've got to be with the group so I can, even what Mike was saying with the other group, you have to be with the group or else you're not safe. And it comes back to basic instinctual animal instinct. And the only way we overcome it is to kind of go to the other parts of the brain that become more rational and can think more, and then look at the shadow side and look at it from a bigger picture. We're all trying to stay safe. We all want to be eaten by the other lions.
Interesting that you say that. Have I mentioned another book? I can put it in the chat. Give me a second here. There's a fascinating book by Avi Tushman called Our Political Nature. And I talked, a couple weeks ago, I think, about Phil Zimbardo's book, The Lucifer Effect, where he summarizes research done in the 60s and 70s, again, trying to understand why what happened in Nazi Germany could happen. People's willingness to violate their own internal moral code in obedience to some external authority, for example. Tushman reviews some of that same research and more recent stuff done in the 80s and even into the 90s. And this book came out, I think, in 2015. And one of the interesting findings is that given the modern theory of personality called the 5-factor theory, 2 of those 5 factors are openness and conscientiousness. And that those who tend to have a more liberal political view tend to score high in the openness personality factor. Those who tend to associate with more conservative political views score high in the conscientiousness factor. And again, he reviews the experimental data and the studies and so forth, and then says, as a result of these personality differences, we can give 4-year-olds a personality test and predict with a very high degree of accuracy when they grow up which political party they're going to affiliate with. And B, some of the social issues and policies and political slants between the 2 groups can be directly related to these personality factors. And those who score high in conscientiousness value order, predictability, stability, homogeneity. They tend to have a narrower definition of our tribe. People who score high in openness tend to be attracted to the novel, the different, the new, accept diversity. And their definition of tribe is the whole human race. So if you think about the political planks between, say, in America, the Democrats and the Republicans, they have fall amazingly along those lines.
I missed the beginning when you said it's a personality thing.
Yeah. It's rooted in study of, the current dominant theory of personality is called the 5-factor theory.
But how do they test that?
Well, that's,
I mean, how do they find the personality? They take little 5-year-olds and they do
Well,
little
give
tests.
give them child's personality tests, and I don't want to get too technical into that.
Like this one's willing to share its toys and maybe this one isn't. I don't know, but I just made that up.
Read the book. Read the
Okay.
book, Rita.
I know, I'm giving you a hard time,
Yeah.
but
Openness,
talking about human-
conscientiousness,
talking about you,
agreeable-
what is it?
Okay, openness,
Openness?
conscientiousness, agreeableness, extroversion, and neuroticism.
Okay. Now to throw another human behavior in, what was that study where they took college students and they made half of them guards and half of them prisoners?
Oh, that's
Maybe-
Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment.
And then,
And he
Just-
talks about that in his book, The Lucifer Effect.
yeah, that they, and how do people in Germany go to concentration camp as a guard and then come home and have dinner with their family? It's like, how
That's
do they, that's what?
that is the question. And in the second half of the first part of Zimbardo's book, he reviews the research by Michelle and others studying that. How is it that people, like the famous shock experiment?
Yeah.
There's a subject in another room in a chair, and the experimental subject is told by a person in a lab coat, turn up the dial. And the person in the chair, of course, is acting out. They're not really being shocked. But as the dial gets turned up, the perception is they're being really tortured. So at what point will the person turning the dial say to the guy in the lab coat, I'm not doing this anymore?
Right.
How far up the dial are people willing to go before their own internal moral code tells them to defy authority? And it was those kinds of questions about how could good Christian Germans do what they did in the concentration camps and live with themselves?
Yeah.
How do you do that?
Yeah, then how do you go home and have dinner with your family and
Right.
go to sleep and then get up the next day and go turn
Mhm.
on the gas chamber?
Right. And there was a whole raft of experiments in the 50s and 60s and 70s to try and explore exactly that question. And again, Zimbardo in his book, The Lucifer Effect, summarizes that research.
And you're calling it, there's a 5-factor personality?
That's the current supposedly empirically validated theory of personality.
Okay.
And of Jung's original typologies, the one that stood the test of time is his extrovert introvert dyad. So that is one of the 5 factors currently. Anyway, it feels like we've gone down a rabbit hole. So let's get back, because we've only got about 10 more minutes before we have to quit and get ready for 10:30 service. So any more thoughts about the content in chapter 5? Yes, no?
The whole idea of scapegoating seems to rise out of all this.
Scapegoat? Yes.
The whole idea of scapegoating.
Mhm.
And then the Jews were always the perfect and perennial targets
In Christian Europe,
in
yes.
Christian Europe.
Mhm. The pogroms would happen on Good Friday after reading the Passion according to John. Because in John's
Yes.
version, the Jews are the bad guys.
Mm.
In the other synoptics, it's the Pharisees or Sadducees. One of the things I wanted to highlight, and again, if you're looking at the PDF version of the book, it's on page 60. For Rita, looking at it in the collected works, it's the latter half of paragraph 561, which is a fairly lengthy one.
Mm.
It says, it should be worthy of all the attention we can give it, especially to, oh, it says, virtually everything depends on the human soul and its functions. It should be worthy of all the attention we can give it, especially today, when everyone admits that the weal or woe of the future will be decided neither by the attacks of wild animals, nor by natural catastrophes, nor by the danger of worldwide epidemics, but simply and solely by the psychic changes in man. It needs only an almost imperceptible disturbance of equilibrium in a few of our rulers' heads to plunge the world into blood, fire, and radioactivity. And of course, he's writing this at the height of the Cold War,
Mhm.
when the United States and the Soviet Union are nuclear powers. After last week's climate change conference, we might want to revise what he just said, because the end of the world could be by natural catastrophe. But of course, that wasn't on his screen in the mid-1950s. He says the technical means necessary for this are present on both sides, and he means on both sides of the Iron Curtain. And certain conscious deliberations, uncontrolled by any inner opponent, can be indulged in all too easily, as we have already seen from the example of one leader. And that's in quotes and capitalized because, of course, in German, that's what Hitler was called, der Führer, which simply means the leader. But we see that today in North Korea. Kim Jong-un is called dear leader.
Mhm.
And Xi Jinping in China is further consolidating his power. And again, we're seeing this around the world. Erdogan has done it in Turkey. Orban has done it in Hungary. Putin has done it in Russia. Trump tried to do it here. So it is a human condition. It's not limited to any one nationality. There was a lot of good stuff in this chapter. This is a fantastic book. I've been reading it for 50 years and it just keeps hitting me on my ass. It's just, wow. How can this guy be so smart? And we're almost out of time.
I like the very last paragraph. It was such a good ending.
Thank you,
Here-
Sandy. I was just about to point us in that direction. Go ahead.
Do you want to read the last paragraph?
No, why don't you read it for us?
Here, each of us must ask, have I any religious experience and immediate relation to God, and hence that certainty which will keep me as an individual from dissolving in the crowd?
Yes. Your sound was a little bit garbled there, so I'm going to restate it.
Okay.
Here we must ask, have I any religious experience and immediate relation to God, and hence that certainty which will keep me as an individual from dissolving in the crowd? Right. So in other words, it's not a belief in a creed or a set of dogma.
Mhm.
It's a personal encounter with the numinous that roots us immediately into a sense that there is something bigger than me that is worth holding on to. And that is the antidote to being, as he says here, dissolving into a crowd, a nameless, faceless mass, whether that's a political party or a nation or a socioeconomic niche, doesn't matter. For Jung, it's the individual that's important. And all that stands between us and, in his day, nuclear annihilation.
Yeah.
So, well, thank you all. Next week, we've got to cover the last 2 chapters in 1 hour, and it's going to get fun. And I want to save a little bit of time at the end of our session to discuss about what we want to do next and when. I've been thinking of taking a break and doing this again, perhaps in Lent, and doing, back in August, we did that survey of how many wanted to do this and how many wanted to do something else. And it was an even split. I mean, right down the middle. So I was the tiebreaker, but I'm personally biased. So the other alternative was to read a book that I have taught in 3 or 4 other churches by Bart Ehrman called Jesus Interrupted, which is basically an introduction to New Testament criticism. And so that is an option. So we can, but that means waiting until Lent, which is like February, March. Last year, I also did on a Wednesday evening, a Zoom session through Advent, just looking at the scripture lessons for the Sundays in Advent. So I'm going to bounce some ideas off Brad here and see if he has any druthers and get you all's opinion, and then we'll take it from there. So thank you for showing up live or by Zoom. And I'll look forward to seeing you all next week, and we'll wrap up our discussion of Jung and the undiscovered self. Okay?
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Hi, guys.
Bye-bye.
Have a good week.
See you next week.
Bye.